Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 10 Summer Blockbuster Movies of 2016. So between the months of May and August, I saw 10 movies in the theaters that would be classified as big budget blockbusters, and I'm here now to rate those movies from my least favorite to my favorite. So as I said, I only saw 10 movies this summer, which in fact is winter for me here in New Zealand, but let's not get into semantics. Anyway, so if a movie doesn't appear on this list, that doesn't mean I think it's worse than the others on this list, it just means that I didn't see it. So at the start of the summer, I made a list of 10 movies I was going to see as the ones that looked most interesting to me, or at least intrigued me in some way. There are several big movies this summer that I didn't see, such as the new Ghostbusters movie, and I gotta admit I was curious with all the buzz about it, but the ultimate reason I didn't see it wasn't because it was a remake cash grab, but more to do with the fact that I don't like Paul Feig. One reviewer said that it's a typical Paul Feig movie, and those who like his types of movie will like this movie, and those that don't probably won't. And I absolutely don't. In fact, even the people that really liked this movie said, well, it wasn't as good as Spy, and I thought Spy sucked. So I can only imagine how much I would have hated this movie. I also didn't see Jason Bourne, as I've never been a fan of these Bourne movies. I don't hate them, but they're just generic action movies to me, and honestly they all blend together in my memory, and I wouldn't be able to tell you which one was which. And from what I hear, this was the most generic of them all. I also steered clear of many comedies such as Neighbors 2, Mike and Dave Need Wedding Dates, and the yet-to-be-released Sausage Party, as modern comedies aren't really my thing. I also steered clear of horrors like The Conjuring 2 and Lights Out, because horror isn't really my thing either. And I avoided some other movies like The Legend of Tarzan, Angry Birds, and the newest Ice Age film because they look fucking stupid. That being said, it is possible I would have liked some of these movies I didn't see better than some of the ones that I did see, as they weren't all pure gold either, which I'm about to get into, but oh well. Also excluded from my list is any independent or low-budget film that just happened to come out during the summer, as there were several movies I would have rather seen, like the upcoming The Founder starring Michael Keaton, but I didn't deem it blockbustery enough. However, if you do want to see me talk about indie films, you can check out my top 10 film festival movies of 2016 video that I did last week, which I'll leave a link to in the description below. This video, however, is just for big budget blockbusters. So let's start off my top 10, starting with my number 10 and thus least favorite movie that I saw this summer, The BFG. So when I heard that Steven Spielberg was directing a beloved kids novel with a score by John Williams, I was there. And even the reviews of this movie seemed somewhat positive, if not a bit mixed. But boy, did this movie suck. It was the only one I saw this summer where I had to force myself to sit through it. Every instinct I had desperately wanted to walk out of the theater. I kept trying to tell myself I was being unfair to it because it's a kids movie, and perhaps I need to judge it as a kids movie. But there's another kids movie that's much higher on this list that I've really enjoyed. So, I know kids movies can be good. This was crap. And besides, I wouldn't say I was the only one bored with it, as in the cinema that I saw, there were several kids who got so bored with this movie they were jumping up and running down the aisles. This movie was incredibly slow and boring, and I know it's based off of a classic fantasy book, and they tend to have these crazy plot structures, but come on, this is an adaptation. The whole point of an adaptation is to adapt it to fit the movie format, so I don't want to hear the excuse that, oh, it's based off a book. That doesn't matter how good the book is if the movie adaptation is meant to work on screen, which this totally does not. About halfway through this movie, they bring this plot with the Queen and her using the British Army to fight the Giants, literally out of nowhere. I mean, completely out of nowhere. There was absolutely no setup for this whatsoever. Not even a mention that this Queen even fucking existed. It was just like all of a sudden the little girl is like, hey, do you know what we can do? We'll get the Queen to help. And I'm sorry, but where the fuck did that come from? And from then on out, it was just a bunch of fart jokes, which I really had to like fight myself to not get up and walk out of the theater. And it ended up ending in a typical CGI action that all the modern movies had to do. I'm sorry, but kids movie or no, this movie sucked. I never will get those 2 hours of my life back. So my rating for the BFG out of 10 is a 2, extremely poor. Number 9 on my list is Warcraft. I came into this movie knowing absolutely nothing about Warcraft, as I'm not much of a gamer, thus I've never played this game before, but I had high hopes for it, as I thought it could be a solid fantasy franchise, as it had a lot of pre-established mythology to draw from, as well as a good director. However, unfortunately, this movie also sucked. It reminded me a lot of The Golden Compass, as it had that same feel to it, which must be the feel of a bad adaptation, as everything seems rushed, like they're trying to cram too much into one movie, as I never really felt part of this world. A lot of fans of the game seem to love this movie, while those like myself, who know nothing about the game and came into it cold, didn't really like this movie, which only reasserts my feelings that you need to already be familiar with the source material in order to enjoy this film, which is never a sign of a good movie. While I wasn't as eager to get out of the theater and leave as I was in the BFG, I did fall asleep for a couple of minutes in this film, and it had some good intriguing parts to it, and I thought it had a lot of potential, but then they would always fall flat on the potential and never pay it off. Such as my favorite character in the film was Granola, the half-human, half-orc, but I ultimately didn't like what they did with her character. In fact, I felt all the characters in this film had bad character arcs and an ending that the film never earned. So I had a hard time buying it. And it did also have a flat, cartoony or 90s syndicated show feel to it that was hard to shake. And frankly, I expected a lot more from a director like Duncan Jones. So my rating for Warcraft out of 10 is a 3, very poor. Number 8 on my list is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Out of the Shadows. Now, you may be wondering why I even bothered seeing this movie, which is fair, as I was asking myself the same thing the entire time I was watching this film. And I'll be honest, I didn't even see the first one, as it looked like a typical Michael Bay garbage, even though I know he only produced and didn't direct it. However, the reason I saw this one is because I heard it was much improved and that they were specifically trying to pander to fans of the cartoon by bringing back characters like Bebop and Rocksteady and Krang. The 1990s movies were more taken from the comic books. In fact, they were avoiding being like the cartoon, so I was curious to see what a film that took more directly from the cartoon would look like. And to be completely honest, I used to be a gigantic Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles fan when I was 11, 12 years old. So yeah, there was a lot of nostalgia involved. And indeed, had I seen this film when I was 12 years old, I would have thought it was the best thing ever made. However, I am not 12 years old anymore, so I noticed a lot of the glaring plot holes, two-dimensional characters, and jokes that weren't at all funny. And although I still question my decision to actually pay money to see this in the theaters, I have to admit that it was kind of fun. And at least, it did have a good, overwhelming theme that played out really well about the turtles dealing with being outcasts and learning to accept themselves for who they are. I thought that was done really nicely, but the main plot with Shredder and Krang sucked. However, nostalgia does go a long way with me in this film, and it did please my inner 12-year-old. So my rating for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Out of the Shadows is a 4 poor. Coming in at number 7 is Independence Day Resurgence. So, shortly before I saw this movie, I saw the critics completely bashing this film and ripping it to shreds, so I went in expecting this movie to suck, and it wasn't that bad. Sure, it wasn't good, and the critics do have some really good points, such as the characters being flat and uninteresting, but wasn't quite as bad as many were making it out to be. Yeah, the main plot simply didn't work as well as the first movie, which was better at building suspense and had a really great structure, but this was more like a mediocre modern day action CGI diarrhea and was kind of just all over the place. However, I don't think the characters were as bad as I found them mildly interesting. And a lot of people say that Jeff Goldblum was the best thing about this movie, and I thought he was pretty good too. But I'd actually say the best thing about this movie was Bill Pullman, as I really liked what they did with his character and I was totally invested. And the plot was again mildly entertaining, so it actually wasn't that bad. But then again, it did have this side plot with Jeff Goldblum's dad, played by the guy from Taxi and Dear John, saving a bunch of kids on a bus, and I have to say that was the most pointless and dumbest side plot I've ever seen, ever. What the actual fuck? So my rating for Independence Day Resurgence is a 5 average. Number 6 on my list is Nice Guys. Now, before I saw this movie, I watched a review that gave it a top rating and said it was one of the best movies of the year, so maybe I was expecting too much, but I wasn't nearly as impressed. The strength of this film is its characters, particularly the relationship between Russell Crowe and Ryan Gosling's characters, where they had a really great chemistry, and they're comparable to any of the classic buddy cop teams out there. But that's it, as the plot was very cliched and unoriginal, and I just outright have to say I thought the ending sucked, and it made me feel like the entire plot was a gigantic waste of time, and I just had many other issues with the ending. But there were a lot of exciting moments in this film, and all the characters were really rich and fascinating, and that counts for a lot. And again, the main chemistry between Ryan Gosling and Russell Crowe, that just, that's almost worth the price of admission right there. So my rating for The Nice Guys is a 6 good. So getting down to my favorites of the summer, let's start with my number 5, Suicide Squad. This was another movie panned by critics that I didn't totally agree with. I mean, 27% on Rotten Tomatoes when X-Men 3 has 58%. Get the fuck out of here. This and another movie that's much higher on my list, I think, are both examples of Hollywood critics getting caught up in this little bubble and community that overanalyzes every trailer, every bit of production news, and online reaction, and they allow this to influence their opinion rather than judging this movie as a movie and judging it on its own merits. For example, many critics say that the film was a mismatch of themes, and I totally disagree, and I think they only feel that way because they heard through the production grapevine that there were reshoots and re-edits after the bad press that Batman v Superman got, and I think that caused them to have these preconceived notions. That being said, this movie isn't perfect, and I do think they do have some good points, such as the movie trying to do too much and the third act being another unremarkable, typical generic comic book movie action drivel with a totally uninteresting villain and yet another Skybeam. However, I totally disagree with them about the musical choices being bad or them overdoing it with the musical montages. It was a stylistic choice, one in which worked really well in other films and I think worked just as well in this film. Some critics are also complaining about how some of the supporting characters were underdeveloped, but I think they're actually being quite naive to expect otherwise. In fact, I would have been shocked beyond belief had these supporting characters not been underdeveloped. That's typically what you expect of a supporting character in a film like this, any film. In fact, many complained about this character who died after 2 minutes, but what's wrong with that? There are tons of characters like that in film, and he served the function that the plot required of him by letting the others know what would happen if they ran. And the film never played him up like he's his main character, so I thought he was great. So, much like the other movies higher on my list, I think the critics simply had unrealistic expectations of these characters because they were already established comic book characters instead of judging this film as a film. And as a film, it really works. Although, critics do recognize that Will Smith as Deadshot and Margot Robbie as Harley Quinn are amazing and totally carried this film. I just disagree that they were the only good thing about it. And the Joker was fine. Perhaps I, was spared the disappointment because I was warned beforehand that he didn't appear that much in the film, but based off of what critics were saying, he appeared a lot more than I thought he would. And Jared Leto was fine, but then again, I'm not a huge Joker fan, so I don't really have that high expectations for this character. I've never been blown away by this character, regardless of who's playing him. He's always been just fine to me, and he's just fine in this movie too. However, I will say that the film definitely dips in quality in the second half, and the first half of the film is much better. So, they did kind of fumble the ending there. But still an entertaining movie, so my rating for Suicide Squad is a 7, very good. Number 4 is Captain America Civil War. Some may be surprised it's so low on my list. If so, you haven't seen my full-length review I did for this movie. In fact, this movie was neck and neck with Suicide Squad for me and just barely edged it out. I think Suicide Squad would have actually got the advantage if it didn't slip up so much in the second half. And of course, this is really contrary to what the critics' reaction would be, as they claimed Civil War is a masterpiece and Suicide Squad is garbage. So why don't I like Captain America Civil War as much as the critics? Well, the ending, particularly involving the villain Zemo, was, whose existence was unnecessary and his plot was so goddamn contrived and unbelievable. It literally pissed me off. In fact, when they revealed what his big, scheme was in a crowded theater, I was literally yelled out, "Oh, come on!" And I'm not typically one to talk in movies. But otherwise, I can see why people loved this film, because it did otherwise have the trademark excellence of the Russo brothers and did some really great character building with Captain America as he made the tough decision to go against the grain, and it was absolutely great in building this epic conflict between the superheroes that paid off in spades. And it's just the tension, the way the tension was built throughout this film was really masterfully done, so it is something you do have to admire and respect. But the ending kinds of ruined this for me, but it was still a great and totally engaging movie, so my rating for Captain America Civil War is a 7, very good. Coming in at number 3 is Finding Dory. Now, I'm not typically one to go all goo-goo for Pixar, but Finding Nemo is tied with 2 other films as my favorite Pixar movie of all time. So I was curious to see a sequel to it and to see if they could pull it off. Was it anywhere near as good as the first one? No. Was it a fun, entertaining movie? You betcha. And it was definitely great to revisit this world with all these characters that we know and love, and frankly they did an amazing job at turning who was a supporting character played mostly for laughs as an intriguing lead character. In fact, they turned what was in the first movie just a gag into a serious plot point of people learning to live and deal with disabilities, which was a really amazing feat. We were also introduced to a lot of great new characters like the crazy sea lions, the squid voiced by Al Bundy that everyone loved, but my personal favorites were the whales, and to see Dory talking whale to them was so great. However, my main issue with this movie was that too much of it took place in the human world and involved fish jumping out of water and trying to travel places on land by jumping into bowls and fountains and buckets and stuff like that. I didn't really find that interesting. And the finale featured a big action sequence involving a truck that was just way too over the top for me. However, that being said, at the heart of this movie was a really touching story of Dory reconnecting with her parents while coming to grips with her own disability, and this was played off amazingly well, and it ended up being one of the more touching Pixar films, while at the same time being a ton of fun. So my rating for Finding Dory is an 8, extremely good. And coming in at number 2 is Star Trek Beyond. So those familiar with my channel will know I'm not a huge fan of the Star Trek reboot films. In fact, after seeing the trailer for this film that made it look like a total disgrace, I was getting all geared up to hate this film. But it actually turned out to be good, and unlike the previous 2 reboot films, it actually felt like a Star Trek film, and it didn't take a huge dump over Gene Roddenberry's legacy. The characters were much more believable and interesting and way more fleshed out. We got a lot of great character interactions between the regulars and the guest alien of Layla, who was a very entertaining addition, added a lot to the film. The emotional stakes were high, and this movie was exciting throughout and had a well-rounded plot with a satisfying resolution. The problem with this film came solely in its villain, which was a textbook, unoriginal, and convoluted villain with a convoluted backstory that didn't really add up. So this did kind of hold this film back, but I was totally okay with the action sequences, even the use of the Beastie Boys song and Kirk riding a dirt bike to save the day. I felt this was pulled off really well, and it didn't at all feel un-Star Trek-like. So unlike what some people would have you believe, I'm not against having modern action in my Star Trek movies. I'm just against having flat, uninteresting characters, a universe that makes no freaking sense, and a chaotic, shitty plot that's just all over the place like the first 2 reboots. This one, however, corrected all those problems, and on top of that, actually felt like Star Trek. So they can have all the action sequences they like as long as they serve the plot, which they totally do in this film. So my rating for Star Trek Beyond is an 8, extremely good. And my number 1 favorite summer blockbuster movie of 2016 is XMen Apocalypse. That's right, you heard me correctly. And since I did 2 whole videos about how wrong the critics were about panning this movie, I'll try not to get too much into that here, but it just blows my mind how wrong critics can get some movies. And like Suicide Squad, this obviously has a lot to do with the Hollywood bubble and unrealistic expectation and bad buzz, like people whining about how Apocalypse looks silly in test screenings rather than judging the movie as a movie. Not on how much you want to see Psylocke or Storm as characters, from the comic books, but judging how they work as characters in an actual film. And overall, I said this is one of my all-time favorite comic book movies. I was completely blown away by it because, I'm of the strong opinion that the key ingredient of any good movie is strong, believable, and relatable characters, and this movie delivered that in spades, mainly with Charles Xavier and Magneto, played amazingly by James McAvoy and Michael Fassbender, who were just great in this film, as well as supporting characters such as Scott Summers, Jean Grey, and Nightcrawler. This, more than any other X-Men film that I've ever seen, seemed to juggle the ensemble cast the best, letting the key characters that needed to shine in an amazing way, while the supporting cast worked well as supporting cast. And I don't give 2 shits about what anyone says. I thought Apocalypse was a great villain. He served the purpose he was meant to serve, and he came off as incredibly menacing, and I totally bought his motivations. And yes, this film did have an over-the-top CGI fest action sequence in this 3rd act, but unlike the majority of other comic book movies, including the Avengers, I felt it actually worked because throughout this action sequence were rich character stories, such as Charles trying to get through to Jean about her full potential, and Mystique trying to get through to Magneto about who his true family was. And those character stories were at the heart of this film, in which the action only enhanced and worked to serve the character stories rather than the characters working to serve the action. That, and we got some more amazing kick-ass Quicksilver scenes which were mind-blowingly good, so you can't go wrong with that. So my rating for XMen Apocalypse is a 9. Excellent. So that's it for my top 10 summer blockbusters of 2016. Be sure to check out my channel for many more movie reviews to come, as well as I do videos on shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, Mr. Robot, Dark Matter, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.